Hey, thanks for joining me. I'm Brandon Lee, and this video is going to be all about the Laowa Argus 28mm T1.0 lens, which is what I'm using to shoot myself right now. This is not a sponsored video. Okay, here's the Argus 28mm T1.0 on my Sony a7S III camera. This is a pretty big, beefy lens. It's about 2.6 pounds, or I think 1.2 kg. That does also make the handheld shots a little bit steadier when you're using it. So pros and cons to that. It has gears for focus. This is a 211 degree focus throw on this focus gear. And it also has a gear for the aperture, so you can rig this for cinema usage with a follow focus or a full FIZ unit. It has a 77mm filter thread, which is great for me because that's what I adapt all of my filters to. The minimum focus is about 16 inches or 22 centimeters, which is pretty close, but not quite macro. And Laowa claims that this lens has exceptional sharpness and less chromatic aberration, even at the maximum aperture of T1.0. And that's kind of a special feature of this Argus series of lenses. They are designed to be used at that maximum aperture without too many flaws in the image. I recently took this lens out for a commercial shoot in Polynesia for Windstar Cruises. You can see that extreme 3D pop that you get with this super wide aperture. The boat stands out from the water dramatically, even though I'm filming with a wider focal length. This ability to slice out my subject from the background is what really made me want to use the Argus 28 on this shoot. Subjects in the foreground are clearly separated from what's behind them, which allowed me to create layers in the composition while keeping enough field of view to capture the scenery. And it did mount and balance properly on my DJI RS4 Mini gimbal. So one of the reasons I was really interested in this lens is because it combines that wide field of view with a super wide aperture. And you can separate your subject from the background even when you're doing a wider composition like we have here. The camera's about 2 meters away from me right now, and I'm still really well separated from what's back there because of that extremely narrow plane of focus. Now I've closed down the lens to T3.2, which is approximately f2.8 in photography terms, and you see there's a lot less separation between me and the background. The image is also considerably sharper because we no longer have the little artifacts of the super wide aperture, but we do lose some of that separation, and I do melt into the background a bit more. Now we're at approximately T6.0, f5.6, and you can see the background is a lot more in focus. So this is the look you get when you stop down with this lens. On the Windstar shoot, I frequently use this lens for portraits of people in their environments, also known as environmental portraits. I wanted shots that felt warm and inviting, yet still kept a strong sense of the location. I shot most of these at T1.2 just to get a little more sharpness in the image and a little less chromatic aberration. In these portraits of a French Polynesian man named Tihote, I was able to separate him from the palm trees behind without turning them all into a blurry mess. This is for a travel ad, so I didn't want to blur out the destination. One note is that you'll need a really strong ND filter to use this lens in daylight at maximum aperture. I frequently needed about 8 stops of darkening, so I stacked an ND64 on top of my variable ND. Of course, a major reason why a lot of people would want to use this lens is because of the low light performance. You can shoot in really dark environments at a low ISO and get a much richer exposure. Because when you keep the ISO low, you have more dynamic range, meaning that I'm exposed properly in this dark sort of alley that I'm in, as well as the brighter parts of the scene, such as the shot behind me. You can still see the details in the highlights back there. And if I had to boost up the ISO to get the proper exposure, I would lose a lot of detail either in the highlights or the shadows, depending on how I chose to expose. One thing to consider about shooting with ultra-wide aperture lenses like this one is if you want that low light performance, but you don't necessarily want that really dreamy look to your shot, you can just focus on subjects that are further away. Right now I'm about 6 meters away from the camera, which means that the camera is focused pretty close to hyperfocal. In other words, close to infinity. So we have a pretty deep depth of field in this shot, even though I'm still shooting at T1.1. But it doesn't look weird, right? It just looks like a pretty normal shot at a normal aperture, but I'm still able to get a good exposure at my base ISO. Here's some low light shots from my Windstar shoot. You can see that they retain a lot of rich detail in the highlights and the shadows, despite the challenging contrast in the environment. There's a lot of subtle hues in a Polynesian sunset, and I didn't want to lose any of them due to ISO noise. And even though I was using a really wide aperture, because I was focused at infinity, these shots look fairly normal. They don't have a dreamy, unnatural appearance. Okay, thanks so much for watching. Once again, I am Brandon Lee, and this has been a video about the Laowa Argus 28mm T1.0 lens, and there will be a link in the description if you want to learn more. Thank you to Laowa for letting me test this lens, and thank you to Windstar Cruises for letting me use this footage. I'll see you next time.